You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by Ellie Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 22. There's nothing flamboyant about a North Dakota farm auction. There is also nothing like a North Dakota farm auction, or any rural auction for that matter. When one considers the auction process, film clips of Sotheby's or Christie's auctions come to mind. Of course, these auctions are conducted with the utmost dignity and decorum. A particular item of value is displayed for auction. The item presented for auction is usually a highly esteemed antique, and the auctioneer adds to this impression by creating an air of sophistication. He is often a polished, attractive individual, tastefully and formally dressed. Even the auction attendees appear to be refined and well educated. As they demurely bid for their expensive, highly sought-after prize, every move is calculated, every action is plotted. No words are wasted, and every nod is purposeful. That being said, a rural farm auction differs tremendously from its city cousin. If one has never been raised on or near a farm, one might ever be denied the satisfaction of such a circus. A North Dakota farm, or any Midwest farm auction, is much like an estate carnival. If the seller is fortunate to still be among the living, he or she may choose to hold an auction in order to retire, liquidate the farm, buy a Winnebago, and travel. If the seller has been reduced to auction because of rotten luck, death, or other tragedy, buyers clamor in from miles away to capitalize on the seller's misfortune just the same. It makes no difference what the purpose of the sale is. What matters are the items being sold, their perceived value to the buyer, and how much the buyer is willing to pay for the privilege of taking them off the seller's hands. During a rural auction, nothing is overblown. Nothing comes with a warranty. Every item is sold as is. And remarkably, buyers may perceive value in the seemingly worthless. This was the case with the auction of the estate of Stanley Peters Senior, who had recently met his untimely demise in the barn of his North Dakota farm. Unlike its city cousin counterpart, the country auction setting is almost always the site of the estate being liquidated. There are no luxuriously upholstered chairs in which to recline. Bidders stand uncomfortably all day long, often arriving hours earlier to inspect the desired merchandise. One has the opportunity to kick the tires, so to speak, since it is clearly understood that every item is sold as is. As in any auction, the phrase of the day is buyer beware. If one has purchased a lemon, one is stuck with a lemon. There are no refunds of any kind for an unsatisfied customer of auctioned goods. Finally, the demeanor of the auctioneer for a farm auction is significantly different from that of a Sotheby's auction. One can rely on the former auctioneer to always be comically entertaining. He and his runners work very hard for their keep, which consists entirely of an agreed-upon percentage of the auction's profits. Therefore, it is in the auctioneer's best interest to fetch the highest price for the item. A skilled farm auctioneer can fly by the seat of his pants, making even the most unfavorable items seem more attractive to the potential buyer. The key for the successful auctioneer is to strike a fine balance between offering the deal of a lifetime and giving the show of a lifetime. Even the mere sing-songy refrain of the auctioneer's voice hypnotically lulls any potential buyers into bidding on an otherwise ordinary and commonplace piece of crap. As he entertains bids from the crowd, he interjects a cacophony of nonverbal sounds. Buyers are invited to ask pointed questions about the product and inspect it one last time before they fancy a bid. All the while, appointed runners weave through the standing crowd displaying boxes of items small enough to carry for any last-minute inspection. After Stanley married Ellen and moved to the Sievertson farm, he brought with him all his belongings from Texas. During his subsequent 27-year marriage to Ellie, he attended every local auction held within a 100-mile radius of their farm in Himmel. After each said auction, Stanley inevitably returned home with at least 10 or 12 newly acquired items. These purchases were collectibles ranging from small knickknacks to monstrosities such as old car frames and farm equipment he never used. In addition, some of the tools formerly belonged to Anders before he died. Most of these more archaic farm utensils were hand-operated, and all of Anders' rare automated machinery had fallen into an inoperable state of disrepair under Stanley's supervision. The auction of Stanley Peters' estate began promptly at 10 a.m. Some of the more anxious townspeople of Himmel showed up at the old Sievertson farm as early as 8 a.m. with the sole intent to inventory the items being offered up for sale. Some might have considered the assembly of this congregation somewhat disrespectful to the memory of the recently deceased. To an outsider, it might have seemed as though the entire town of Himmel had anticipated Stanley's inevitable demise for quite some time, much like a group of vultures circling a dying elephant on the Serengeti. Perhaps if Stanley were someone other than Stanley Peters Senior, a more respected citizen of the town, for example, the citizens of Himmel might be more reluctant to so quickly lay claim to his numerous possessions. They might have at least granted Stanley's family a decent period of mourning before swooping down on their prey in search of fresh meat. Even though most Himmelians graciously ignored Stanley Peters' cantankerousness throughout the last 27 years, no one in town ever claimed to like him. He had wronged, insulted, abused, or owed money to nearly every member of the Himmel community at some point during his career as the town drunk. No one suffered from the loss of Stanley Peters, and a few outspoken individuals in the town, Margie included, openly admitted that Stanley and his family were better off now that he was finally dead. Ultimately, the nature of auctions in North Dakota, as with all estate sales, has always been more of a practical resignation to the cyclicality of life. As man turns to dust, so too do his prized possessions change hands of ownership. Life moves on, and so do the everyday things from which life's pleasures are ultimately derived. The auction of Stanley's estate began with the smaller, more incidental items being offered for bid first. As the day progressed, and the two flatbed trailers were emptied of their wares, the crowd migrated toward the larger farm tools and equipment, which surrounded the periphery of the barn. The old car skeletons and frames littering the estate were the next to go. Finally, the guns and hire ticket items were the last to be sold. In this way, the auctioneer could guarantee crowd participation until the finale, after the last bid for the most desirable items was accepted. The first item up for bid was a large box of Stanley's books. These were clearly books that Stanley never read, which he mainly kept stacked on his bookshelf in the living room farmhouse. These were also the books that Ellie had relocated to the barn the previous November, just before Stanley's death. Most of the books were works of fiction, true crime, romance novels, and murder mysteries, whose spines were still as crisp as if they had never been opened. An occasional book in the collection was well worn by an avid reader, but these were obviously gleaned from a reader/seller at another auction. But by and large, almost all the books contained in Stanley's collection were in near mint condition. 25, 5, 25, can I get 5, 10, 20, 5, 20? The auctioneer chanted his multisyllabic gibberish, interspersed with scant information about the current high bid. He pointed to an interested bidder who nodded plainly as he exhibited an interest in the books. The bidding soon climaxed and then waned as the bid price climbed until all but one bidder withdrew his interest. Soon, the auctioneer pointed to Doris Baker and announced, "Sold to the young lady in the back." Doris smiled as the auctioneer held up yet another box of books to auction. This box contained books of a different variety. Most were hunting and fishing manuals. Also included in this stack were several collectors' catalogs for guns and rifles. The auctioneer tried to entice potential buyers for the antique guns being sold later that day. "Want to know how much those guns are going to be worth? Right here, it's all right here. Can I get 20 for an opening bid?" Doris stood by later as the opening bid was placed for one of Stanley's bookshelves. Paul bid $11. Befuddled, Doris quizzed Paul as to why he would even bid on a bookcase. He thoughtfully responded, "You're going to need something to put your new books in." The stacks of National Enquirer magazine were the next to go. It was easier to see how the auctioneer was so successful at his craft. He had a knack for making even the most humdrum of collections seem fascinating. "Here's a little bit of history right here. Be part of the celebrity lifestyle right here in Himmel. Can I have $5 for an opening bid?" Sure enough, the stacks of Warren's Scandal magazines fetched the sum of $5 from bidder Elmer Geertsen. As the auction of the smaller items progressed, Marge and Stan assisted the runners by displaying the boxes of items throughout the buying crowd. In addition, if a potential buyer hollered out a question about the merchandise, Stan quickly blurted out what scant information he had regarding the condition or age of the item. Of course, all this information was provided solely to aid the potential buyer in making a wisely informed purchase. The crowd moved to the larger items. Stan stood by, juiced with adrenaline and ready to answer any additional questions about the products being sold. But at this point, Marge soon found herself largely obsolete. As a result, she treated herself to some cotton candy and a large glass of lemonade at a vendor's food trailer. As the spectators' level of engagement grew in intensity, Marge had also become so engrossed in the auction that she quickly forgot about her dramatic confession at Sheriff Baker's office just hours earlier. Soon, the final bid was complete, and the long day of auctioning had ended. Both the attendees and the auctioneers were exhausted. The last of the bills had been settled up, and the crowd had dissipated. If the purchased items were sufficiently small enough to be hauled away in a box, the victor left carrying his spoils home. Otherwise, the purchasers made arrangements to tow the larger items at a future date. Mr. Olstad had purchased Stanley's 1955 Willys Jeep. He planned to show up the next morning with a trailer to haul all the spare car parts and frame away. Sheriff Baker picked up Doris's box of books and handed them to his eldest son. He also handed him the Winchester 1200 rifle, which he acquired for $50. He handed the bookcase to his youngest son. "Take these out to the truck, would you, boys?" His obedient sons did as they were instructed. Paul then turned to Marge. "Looks like you did pretty good selling your goods, Marge," he commented. "Had a pretty good turnout of townsfolk here, eh? I think we cleaned you out." "I'm amazed that anyone would even buy this shit," Marge answered. "Of course, your stuff's not shit, Paul, but it was hard to see anybody taking an interest in any of that other junk. I can't believe that half-filled box of empty spray paint cans sold. What are people thinking? I'm not sure I would have paid $1 for that myself, but Ed Gunderson will probably find a use for it. One thing about Stanley Peters, he sure didn't like to part with anything." Paul snickered, while Doris seemed clearly amused. "That's putting it mildly, Sheriff. I hope that Stan Jr. decides that all his profits have been worth this effort," Marge added. "I was disappointed to see that you took the pistols off the auction blocks," Paul commented sadly. "I guess Stan Jr. decided to keep them as mementos of his dad. Everything else got sold, and he plans on giving all the proceeds to Ellie," Margie stated. "You know, Miss Marge, it's also been hard to see how Stanley Peters could have sired such a decent young man," Paul commented. "I suppose it has more to do with his mother's influence than anything else. Miss Sievertson's a good woman." Marge agreed with the sheriff. I've always wondered how Stanley could have spawned such a great kid myself. Stan Jr. doesn't have a mean bone in his entire body. Ellie sure did something right. Although Marge had been distracted by the auction, both Paul and Doris sensed her growing look of distress. She seemed both preoccupied with Stanley's pending murder investigation and concern for her little sister. Miss Severson's fortunate to have her son and sister around to help, Paul complimented. Doris patted Marge assuringly on the shoulder. It'll all work out, Marge. Just wait and see. Hope so, Doris. At this point, all I can do is wait and see, Margie responded blankly. Early the following afternoon, Joseph drove Ellen home to North Dakota. They left Minneapolis before sunrise, making only a few brief stops during their trip. Joseph wanted to make good time because he needed to return to Minnesota shortly after midnight and be to work early the next morning. Marge greeted the travelers in the driveway as they approached the farmhouse. She had just finished cleaning the barn. Stan Jr. was in town to get his final check from the auction proceeds. Marge wore a pair of Stanley's old overalls, which were clearly about 20 inches too long in the waist. The excess fabric hung in flaps and puckers around her waist and thighs. She comically resembled a pregnant woman in denim riding chaps. She opened the door for Ellie, greeting her sister with her customary cheek-to-cheek embrace. How are ya, lass? Oh, we're just peachy, hon, Ellen answered. My nephew was a wonderful host. I had a good visit with Lars and Gunnar, she added. How are the little imps? Marge inquired sarcastically. Well, hon, they're not quite so little anymore, but they're still ornery as ever, Ellie joked. Little Robert let out a whine, reminding Ellen that he was patiently awaiting rescue from the back seat. Okay, hon, I'm coming, she assured. She unlatched his car seat and handed the infant to Marge. Marge hid her face behind the baby as she whispered to Joseph. How'd Ellie do? She asked, careful not to let her sister hear. Fine, Ma, Joseph whispered, not moving his lips. She's nuts, but she's harmless. I wouldn't be so sure about that, his mother commented under her breath. After a considerable bit of struggling, Ellen finally managed to free Robert's carrier from the back seat. Margie invited Joseph into the house for grub. Are you hungry? No, Joseph replied. Gotta get back to work. Uncle Lars needs me in the morning. Are you sure? Marge asked. I could threaten to rough him up a little again. Don't be ridiculous, Ma. I actually need my job. Joseph kissed Marge and Ellen farewell. Bye, Ma. Bye, Aunt Ellie. Thanks for coming to visit. He turned to shake little Robert's slobbery hand. So long, little man. Come see us again. They each waved goodbye to Joseph as he boarded his car and drove out of sight. Ellen noted the farm's newly barren landscape. Where are all Stanley's cars? She asked, puzzled. Marge reluctantly began her explanation of the prior week's events. Sister, you and I need to talk. Margie, Ellen asked suspiciously, what did you do? I should probably show you what I did, Margie stated cautiously. But just in case, I'm going to hold little Robert. She directed her sister out to the open barn doors. The two sisters approached the barn. Ellie stood dumbstruck. She gazed into the empty barn, which had once been piled floor to ceiling with all of Stanley's possessions. All that remained in the barn now were a few hand tools and 50 feet of heavy-duty rope. Everything else had been auctioned off or hauled away. Even the straw from the floor had been swept away and burned. Oh my gosh, Marge! What happened? Ellie exclaimed in a tone of sheer panic. Margie held little Robert in front of her face defensively. Don't hurt me, Ellie. Remember, I'm holding your grandchild. Little Robert babbled and sucked on his fist. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his great aunt was now using him as a human shield. Marge blurted, "We auctioned off all of Stanley's shit." Shocked, Ellen surveyed the empty barn. "Oh, my heavens," she uttered weakly. Then her face transitioned to a look of sheer horror as she recalled her husband's final threats of retaliation for anyone who tampered with his belongings. "Stanley will be furious when he comes home." Overwhelmed, she collapsed on the inverted paint bucket. "Oh, Marge, what am I going to tell Stanley?" Marge watched Ellen in a state of disbelief. She had been so sure that Ellie had murdered Stanley, yet she still anticipated his return. Ellie is obviously in denial about this whole thing. Doesn't she remember leaving his corpse to rot in the barn? Margie stuttered as she squatted down to speak to her sister. She perched Robert on her hip and focused intently on her sister's face. "Wait a minute, Ellie. You mean you really don't remember what happened to Stanley?" Ellen responded, "No, Margie. Why? What happened to him?" Margie astonishedly contemplated her sister's response. Perhaps she truly had blocked this entire traumatic episode from her mind. Surely she would admit to me, her trusted sister, if she remembered killing him. What does she have to hide from me? Ellen repeated her question for her older sister. "Tell me, Margie, where's Stanley?" Margie's mind was instantly flooded with feelings of extreme guilt. If Ellie had murdered Stanley as she suspected, and she obliterated the entire episode from her memory, why should Marge accuse her of being a murderess now? She had gone to such great lengths to protect her younger sister thus far. Yes, Paul Baker had stifled her previous efforts to confess to the murder, but he had only postponed the inevitable. Eventually, Marge would have to falsely confess to the crime, brandishing both the murder weapon and Ellie's lefse pin. But still, there was absolutely no way Marge was going to let her little sister go to jail. How would reminding Ellie that she was Stanley's killer ultimately help her now? Marge considered her response to Ellie. She finally determined that it would not be helpful to disclose the truth to Ellen. Better to lie to Ellie and tell her that Stanley simply died in the barn, buried under a pile of his own tools. Farm accidents happen every day in North Dakota. That explanation wouldn't be too far-fetched. It won't do anyone any good to lay the blame on my already traumatized, half-senile sister. When it comes time for me to confess to the crime, Ellen might hate me, but she wouldn't have to hate herself. No, she thought to herself resolutely. There is no way that I can accuse the sweetest person alive of murdering a man who quite possibly was the most hateful, despicable human being to ever walk the face of the earth. As she considered these things, Margie resolved that she would never disclose the truth about Stanley's death to her youngest sister. She decided that she would simply tell Ellen exactly what Ellen needed to hear. And what Ellen needed to hear was nothing but a calculated and deliberate, bold-faced lie. Margie looked Ellen squarely in the eye. "Sister," she began earnestly, "I don't know how to tell you this, so I'm going to come right out and say it. Stanley's not coming back for his things. As a matter of fact, Stanley's not coming back ever."